Good evening. Thank y'all for having me. I really appreciate y'all's patience with me. This has been a long month, 5 Wednesdays, and it's not necessarily the funnest topic to be talking about, but we do believe it's a very important topic to talk about. So the more information you have early on, hopefully the more it'll benefit you later on. So thank y'all so much for your attention and your feedback, and for I like the visual feedback of people actually looking at me and smiling. So it's been probably a more fun week than it was last week, is that right? And we've had a week of summer, 1 full week without school. No, it hadn't been that fun. Okay, all right, we're probably adjusting to the new sleep schedule. Feels a little bit like jet lag, right? Okay, well good. Tonight's topic is addictive behavior or addictions. When you think about the term addiction, what kind of thing comes to mind?
Drugs.
Okay, drugs, certainly. That certainly captures a lot of attention that we have.
Food.
Food, okay. We will actually not be talking about that tonight. But that is a topic that has some addictive qualities and can have some consequences. Yes. I'm sorry?
Caffeine.
Caffeine, okay, all right. Olivia?
Habits.
Habits, very good, yes. Yeah, so a lot of what we're talking about, in most of the things in my realm of work in psychology, is on a spectrum. It's one or the other. And it's like, if you go to the doctor, you either have the flu or you don't have the flu. You don't kind of have the flu. If you're a young married woman, you're not going to be diagnosed as kind of pregnant. You're either going to be pregnant or not pregnant, right? But in psychology, we talk about things in the spectrum. You can be kind of depressed, or you can have a major depressive episode. You can have some anxiety, or you can have a panic attack. So a lot of things are somewhere on the spectrum. And we're talking about, as Olivia said, talking about habits, but habits that are somewhat self-destructive. I mean, for the most part, we do things because they work for us, right? This is a very odd type of human behavior. Habits that we have that are very harmful to us, but we continue to do it. And so there's a lot of confusion on the outside of why does this take place. There's a lot of confusion on the inside of how do I keep it from taking place and moving forward. We'll get past the academic part of this, looking at the definition of addiction. Addiction is a condition in which a person engages in the use of a substance or in a behavior for which the rewarding effects provide a compelling incentive to continue the behavior despite overwhelming consequences. So basically what that says is addiction is something people do because there's some type of benefit, but the detriment, the consequences are overwhelming and continue to get worse. In that definition, you see engages in the use of a substance or in behavior. And tonight we're going to take a look at chemical or substance addiction and behavioral addiction. And they have a lot of similarities. They have a lot of differences as well, especially in how they're treated. When we look at chemical or substance addiction, we're looking at alcohol, marijuana, drugs, legal and illegal, and tobacco. These are all addictive elements of our society that are also harmful. Isaac talked about caffeine being an addiction, and yes, it is. But we don't see a lot of harmful effects that come from it. We don't see major illnesses. We don't see tremendous traffic problems or health risks that go along with caffeine, and to a lesser degree food as well. There are extremes that would make it harmful, but we look at behavioral addictions. This could be sex, pornography, gambling, and gaming. And gaming is something that had a question mark by it up until a few years ago. People were wondering, do we really call it an addiction? It can certainly wrap up people's interest and attention, but is it detrimental to health? Is it detrimental to relationships? And I can say from some of the people I've worked with is yes, it really can. The amount of time that it takes, the amount of deception, hiding involved in it, the detriment from not getting sleep in order to perform the next day's work, or calling in because of that late night, or that rally, or that marathon session, causing workplace problems as well. And even though there's an awareness of, yes, that's not good for me, that's bad, there's also that part that wants to hang on to it, protect it, and shift the blame in other places. So these are the major addictions that we deal with in counseling and in recovery. And so those are the ones that are going to catch our attention. As we look at the differences between the two, the ones that are behavioral, we have a different approach to those. Oftentimes what that mainly needs is accountability. To put some type of focus or put some light on those addictions goes a long ways in how we treat that. And so visibility, awareness, accountability, it's kind of like growing mushrooms. You can do it when there's no light available, when it's dark, when there's limited amount of air movement, when it's musty, when it's concealed. That's a great environment to grow mushrooms. That's a great environment for behavioral addictions as well. When we pull the curtains back, when we flip the lights on, when we have plenty of exposure, mushrooms can't grow and behavioral addictions can't grow either. So that's a great way of addressing those. Chemical or substance abuse chemical or substance addictions are much more difficult and harder to deal with. One of the key characteristics we see about them is that they are progressive in their nature and in their detriment. If an alcoholic or a drug addict were to have their first experience be like their current experience, they would never pursue it. If they realize at the very beginning how disruptive and how harmful this particular activity is, they would never begin. But oftentimes it begins as something very positive in their life. Not healthy, not wholesome, but positive. Usually because there's some type of stress that takes place, they introduce a chemical or a substance into that situation and feel some sense of relief, giving them a reward. Now, what often takes place is that reward system becomes very harmful and dangerous and changes from being a reward to being a negative consequence. There's a famous quote that comes from addictive literature that says, "Addictions take you further than you ever intended to go, keep you longer than you ever intended to stay, and cost you more than you ever intended to spend." And that's something that addicts will often say is, "I had no idea that I spent this much money, that I would spend this much time either hiding my addiction or making arrangements to fulfill my supply, or to just thinking about it, how much of my mental time and mental energy gets used up in this particular endeavor." One of the things we'll say about addictions is that addictions are insane. And you'll hear addicts say, alcoholism is insanity, addiction is insanity. And what they mean by that is that anybody that continually pursues the same set of actions and hopes for a different reaction, that doesn't make sense, right? Why would we continue to do the same thing that doesn't work, hoping that eventually it will work? Typically, if something doesn't work for us, what should we do? Try something else, right? But the addict continues to go back and do what doesn't work for them. There's a proverb that says, "Like the pig freshly washed will return to the mire, so a fool will return to his foolish ways." And that's very much what addiction feels like a pig that's just been washed off and he goes straight back to the mud. The New Testament adds a little extra phrase to it that's a little rougher. It says, like a dog returns to his vomit, so a fool returns to his foolish ways. that's very much what addiction feels like for the addict. A little rough way of looking at the terms there. To go further with this idea or another characteristic of addictions can be very deceptive. Not only is there a lot of deception involved in pursuing an addiction and keeping an addiction going, being deceptive to other people, trying our best to hide it, trying our best to hide the money that's being spent. The addiction itself is deceptive to the addict. The addict's view of reality is very different from the rest of the family. Their memory has been impaired. The events have been clouded by what took place. So oftentimes, I'll see families post-rehab, after they've been to rehab, after they've come back, they're trying to get some sense of normalcy and have the family working together. And the addict is a little bit confused why everybody else in the family seems to be holding such a grudge and so angry and so hostile towards him, because his memories are very different than theirs. His memories are clouded and seemed a lot more enhanced than what everybody else remembers. Everybody else remembers how hard, how difficult, how rough it was. One mother told me, she said, life was like juggling chainsaws. And so when he came home sober, I wanted to celebrate, but also wanted to knock him over the head. You know, the reality was, my life could have been this easy all along. And so even though she's very happy that he's come back sober, she's also now very angry too, because she realizes what reality there could have been instead. The addict continually makes compromises in health, work, and relationships without really fully seeing the negative effects. Oftentimes they're pushing the blame off on other things or other contributing factors, saying this isn't the fault of alcohol, this is the pressures that my job puts on me, or this is the reactions of others that's causing these problems, certainly not the substance. And they begin thinking, this is something that helps me get control. If life gets too stressful, if relationships become too stressful, then I can run over here to my addiction, my substance, whatever that is. Alcohol, let's just use it for an easy example. Life is stressful, I can have a few beers, and all of a sudden, I feel like I'm in control. But what they don't realize is, instead of gaining control, it's a process of giving up control. There's a Chinese proverb that talks about this process of losing control. And it says, the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, then the drink takes the man. It's that sense of losing control through this process. To sum up control and deception through the eyes of the addict, I copied this quote from the most popular author in addictive literature. His name is Anonymous. And he writes, I drank for happiness and became unhappy. I drank for joy and became miserable. I drank to be more sociable and became argumentative. I drank for sophistication and became obnoxious. I drank for friendships and made enemies. I drank for better sleep and woke up tired. I drank for strength and felt weak. I drank for relaxation and got the shakes. I drank for courage and became anxious. I drank for confidence and became doubtful. I drank to make conversation easier and only slurred my speech. I drank to feel heavenly, but felt like I was in hell. We look at that, and this is the way most people look at it, and think, this doesn't make sense. Surely, anybody will look at their situation after careful observation and will choose to make other choices, will divert towards a healthier lifestyle, would certainly pursue something different than what they have. And from outside addiction, that makes sense. If it's not working for you, do something else. And family members, when they continue to see the wrong decisions being made, they often think, what is it about that that's more important than me? that's more important than us? Why is the pursuit of this activity more important than our family? And so there begins this understanding that there's this rival that is now in our family, and so this becomes a force working against the family. So when we look at how this doesn't make sense, the addict is very quick to say, this is insanity. From the outside, we also need to look at how it doesn't make sense. There's a cycle that goes with addiction. It's kind of like that snowball that starts small, and as it rolls down the hill, it gets momentum, it gets bigger, it gets overwhelming. It gets to the point it can knock out a cabin, right? We've seen the cartoon. It works very similarly in addiction. And the cycle begins at the top there with stress. Now this could be stress at work, this could be stress at home, this could be more bills than there is paycheck, it could be more homework than there is time, it could be the stress of no stress, just being bored and looking for something to do. Whatever that stress is, it gets the mind thinking, what can I do? What can I do to make this different? How can I take control? What factors might be, or what solutions might work to move from being an obsession, an occupation of the mind, to being a compulsion or an action where, say, if we're using alcohol as the identified target here, then the thoughts, the obsessions are about, well, if I could just get a few beers. And then it becomes an action where I drink, and I drink, and I drink too much. And then there's the negative physical effects, but the emotional effects that come with that is guilt, shame, remorse, such a bad guy, I'm a loser, and all of that now becomes the new stress. And what do we do with stress? We start thinking about these solutions. What did we do last time we were stressed? Well, we got a six-pack. Okay, so the cycle continues to go. And as they're in it, as they're in that snowball, they don't have the perspective of looking out, seeing how crazy this is. This just looks like, I don't know what else to do, so this is what I'll do. And this is how I'll go about it. Many times we'll see the addict defending the addiction, looking for other things to blame besides themselves, besides the addiction. It's often just pushed off on others. I wouldn't drink if, and not being honest and open about exactly what's going on. A good example of how addictions can be so opposite of logic, a good example I think would be gambling addiction. It's not one we talk about a whole lot because we don't see a lot of health risks that go with it, but can be devastating to a family from a financial point of view. Because like addictions have tolerance. What tolerance means is that each time we use something, we start to build up a sense of strength that goes along with it. So if at one time 3 beers made you drunk, after a certain point, it would take 4 beers to get that certain feeling, and then 5 beers to get that same feeling, and then 6 beers to get that same feeling. Maybe you're at a point where you're drinking 12 and you're thinking, I still don't feel like I did that first time I ever had 2 beers, and not ever able to get that same feeling. So maybe I'll switch to hard liquor. Maybe I'll mix in some prescription medications with it as we go along. So that tolerance level continues to change and go up. Same thing with gambling. It may be the same roulette wheel, but what excitement the $10 bet required, now it's a $100 bet that gets that same amount of adrenaline, that same thrill. And I talked to a gentleman that had pretty much financially ruined his family. He lost his home, had to sell his vehicle and then buy it on credit, a lesser vehicle. They were living with family members, and he was making plans to run off to Bossier City because he had just got paid. And the thought is, why in the world, looking back at what gambling had done to your family, why in the world would you ever think about going into a casino? And he said, you got to use logic here. I thought, okay, please, let's use some logic. He said, I know what I make. I know what I owe. There's no way I can pay it off doing an honest day's work. The only shot I've got at paying off my debt is winning big at the casinos. He was saying where the deception was at is that gambling is the solution. And what I wanted to point out is that your financial problems, that gambling is the problem. His idea was that gambling was a game of skill. Everybody that's a habitual gambler believes they have some type of insight, some system on how this is going to work. And because they have that insight, they're going to make it work. And logic, that they call logic, is very different from what we call logic. The idea is that at some point, I have to win. I'm owed. You know, you play long enough, you're bound to win. The reality is each individual bet has the same poor chances of winning. The Texas lottery, for example, you can pay $1 and get a $3 million payoff. And from perspective of odds, that sounds great, except for your odds of winning are 1 in 128 million. In fact, the odds of being struck by lightning are a lot less. In fact, the odds of being mauled by a grizzly bear and a polar bear in the same day are even better than winning the Texas lottery. I had a friend that called it the voluntary tax for those really bad at math. Anyway, it was a lot funnier at the time. When we talk about addiction, we talk about the flip side: recovery, healing, moving away from addiction, returning to a previous state. Recovery is a word we often talk about because we don't really have medical protocols. We can't put a cast on it. We can't put stitches on it. We can't give a shot for it. So we refer to recovery. That may mean rehab. There may be a need for a chemical detox. If it's a long-term alcohol addiction, then quitting right away could be very harmful. And so we need some medical personnel to help them physically get away from the physical addiction to alcohol and be able to tolerate life, just to make it through rehab. And so oftentimes we take a look at a 4-week course, 28 days. We're told it takes 28 days for a habit to come formed. Olivia used the term habit, replacing old habits with new habits, healthy habits. Sometimes we refer to recovery as sobriety. And unfortunately, a very common component to recovery is relapse. That means returning back to the drug of choice or the behavior of choice. And that can really make the addict feel like failure. It can make the family feel very betrayed to go back to something that doesn't work. But it is a thing that we often experience and have to be on guard for and be prepared for and deal with. I'm going to look at some statistics that are going to be kind of a drag. Actually, just reading through the statistics wasn't fun for me. It was stuff I was like, oh, these are not much different than when I was a kid. Why have we not learned anything? Why are we not better? In fact, we've added quite a few things to the list of things that kids are involved with since I was a kid. An 18-year-old who takes up smoking can spend an estimated $150,000 to $200,000 during their lifetime simply on tobacco products. Can you think of anything else you might want to invest $150,000 in? I can think of a few things, yeah? Okay, y'all may not know what $150,000 would buy. Let's see, 5 pickup trucks, a house. Yeah, it's a lot. Okay, a child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of an alcoholic has a 400% chance greater of being an alcoholic than the rest of the population. And so we see there's a genetic component. It's good to know the family tree. If dad, granddad, great-grandfather, or grandmother, either side, of the family going back. If they had an addiction problem, probably need to keep that bookmarked somewhere in the left or right frontal lobe there, that we need to be careful about substances and habits that may create problems. Yes, sir?
So if there's a 400% chance I talk. There's a 400% chance of a person being an alcoholic. What is the regular chance of someone becoming an alcoholic?
That's very good. We know that about 1 out of every 10 families is impacted by alcoholism or drug addiction. So this is a very huge health problem. But we don't always get a lot of reporting until further down the line. I would say that the individual impact of alcoholism or drug abuse is probably less than 5%. For the general population, my guess is that for a family member of an alcoholic, you're probably going to be close to about 20%. Just shooting from the hip. Another good fact to know is that about 63% of all statistics are made up on the spot. Is that what I said last week? I said 75, didn't I?
63 and a half.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So anyway, my guess would be that it would be a low number for the general population. But if there's a family history, and it's not always clear if it's all genetics or some of it's learned behavior. However, there are individuals, when we talk about an addiction being like a learned behavior, being involved for enough time that it becomes not only a physical addiction, but also a psychological addiction, that usually takes some time to work up to because of exposure. There are certain people that will say with their first drink, they were addicted and they knew this was going to be a huge challenge. Well, their first thought is this is a huge advantage for my life, only to find out it's a huge challenge. And so we can see a definite genetic link in that minority of people. And that is something that is very difficult. And we often hear different literature or different ways of talking about addiction. We'll hear some people talk about it as a disease or an illness. And we do see that brains exposed to chemicals over time does create an illness. And then we'll hear people talk about an illness of the brain causing the disease. The way I like to look at it is kind of like when we're talking about diabetes. We have people that are born with faulty pancreases that don't work. We call those type 1 diabetes. And then we have people that have a lifestyle that generates or creates a diabetic condition later in life. That's called type 2 diabetes. And when we look at alcoholism, we'll see 2 different ways that it kind of interacts with people. People that are immediately addicted and then people that get an addiction after long-term exposure to it. That's a good question, Jonathan. I'm sure you'll have another one for me before the class is over. No? Okay, all right. We'll see. Some other statistics. The younger a person begins drinking, the greater the chance of being addicted. And a lot of the literature I looked at started surveying kids when they were at age 12 with drinking behavior. And addiction stunt emotional growth. What that means is that if a young person were to start using alcohol, marijuana, prescription drugs, something like that, during a tough patch in their adolescence, let's say they're 16 years old and mom and dad are fighting a lot, and so they start stealing from the family liquor cabinet. And then later on they find out, well, I can get alcohol from these people. And then later in life, able to buy their own alcohol. They're a 40-year-old dealing with their own marriage problems and realize that their emotional ability to deal with stress is that of a 16-year-old, because it never matured. It never got challenged enough to grow and evolve to what it needed to be. So we see that drugs and alcohol stunt emotional growth. So whatever age the addict began using is probably the emotional age that they're dealing with their up to where they need to be emotionally with the rest of the adult population. So another big challenge that the addict will face coming out of rehab. Alcohol poisoning deaths among teens have consistently been over 4,000 in the past 7 years in the U.S. This means death. Teens that have died from binge drinking are sitting somewhere around 4,000. I saw figures as high as 4,300 in 1 year. And oftentimes that we see the main way that kids drink is binge drinking, a lot at one time. Individuals age 14 to 20 consume 11% of the nation's total alcohol consumption. What's odd about that statistic? You might think, well, 11% is not a lot, but these are people that aren't allowed to have any, right? Because the legal drinking age is 21, so people 14 to 20 aren't even supposed to be buying alcohol. What's going to happen when they turn 21? Okay. Legal intoxication is defined by the blood alcohol content within our body. And in Texas, and I think it's nationwide, the number is 0.08. It has been reduced from 0.1 to 0.08. Now that doesn't mean a whole lot to you unless you're able to calculate the volume of the blood that you have in your body and compare it to the volume of alcohol that you consume. But if we use some simple tables that the National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has put out, what it calculates to is for any male that's about 200 pounds or less, anything over 3 drinks puts you in a illegal category, not able to drive. And if you're a female and under 160 pounds or 160 pounds or less, that would be anything over 2 drinks. The reason this information is important is because, like I said, that most drinking behavior among teens is binge drinking. That means a lot in a short period of time. And oftentimes we don't use information and statistics to gauge what's normal, what's healthy, what's average. We're looking at the peers that are around us who are also binge drinking as what is healthy and what is normal. So noting that there is very tight limits as to what is healthy for the body to deal with. Now the fact that our blood alcohol content is at a certain point, you may think, oh, well, if you're a long-term drinker, certainly the tolerances will change that. They won't. It's just simple math. It'll still be that same percentage amount. And oftentimes, long-term drinkers that have a high tolerance level may be able to pass a sobriety test because their effects are less prominent. They can't pass a blood alcohol test because it doesn't lie. It shows exactly how much alcohol is in the body. Maybe I have another page. I think I'm quitting too soon. Okay, final page. And then we'll be ready for questions, right? Okay. National trends for teen drinking have gone down while teen use of marijuana is up. A 2016 survey conducted by the Center for Disease Control found that 45% of 12th graders that were surveyed have tried marijuana. And I've often heard from teenagers that it's easier to get marijuana than it is to get alcohol. It's much smaller, it's more transportable, it's easier for the transaction to take place, and it seems to be more readily available in some places than alcohol, which is very scary for us to see that actually be the case. Money-wise, a month in rehab cost about as much as a year in college, except for a year in college can be financed. And a month in rehab can pretty much wipe out parents' savings, so college may not be a reality. And then finally, this comes from Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Drunk or impaired driving wrecks and deaths are 100% preventable. Almost made the mistake of writing down drunk driving accidents are 100% preventable. But MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, does not recognize a drunk driving wreck as an accident because the drinking portion is premeditated and it is fully accountable. So they're very careful to point out that these drunk driving wrecks are not accidents, but are indeed wrecks. Okay, any questions?
For behavioral addictions, are they genetic?
I think you can make an argument for any condition, any human condition to have some genetic link. You can make an argument going back to Adam that we are all genetically predisposed towards sin in general. How that actually lays out is open to interpretation. Certainly among scientists, we're a long ways away from knowing everything there is to know about the genome code and what all is tucked away information-wise within there. With this age group, when we're talking about behavioral addictions, there are things that progress in a very timely biological way, and there are things that progress in a social maturity way at a different rate. So we may be developing glandularly, which means we're starting to have our voices change, we're starting to have acne, we're starting to go through some of the changes that come along with transitioning from children to adults. We may be way ahead on the development of glandular activity, and our interest in sex may be way ahead glandular-wise than our maturity or our social skills are for how to deal with those urges. So biologically, the urges may be there. It may take longer, mature-wise, before how to deal with those urges catch up. And because of the prevalence and the easily accessible access to pornography, that is a tough thing for parents to deal with. Not only at the home computer, but with tablets and now cell phones. That's something that really requires a lot of training, a lot of warning, any type of prevention efforts regarding monitoring systems. Those things are very helpful as well. Good question.
Russell, thinking about if there's a student here who's thinking, yes, that's me. I have this addiction or this behavior. I see it's affecting my life, and maybe no one knows about it. Going back to your perspective of the fungus that's in the dark, help them think about what is that step towards healing that we looked at. What is that first thing to do when they know they have this problem and no one else knows?
Yeah, good question. Andrew, could we move back to the slide that has the cycle on there? The one lowly graphic that I used with all my computer skills. When we take a look at how this takes place, one thing we talked about in recovery is it's not something that takes place in isolation. It's not about willpower. It's not about making choices, better choices. It's about the involvement of others. It's a network, either of fellow struggling addicts or a network from the outside working inward. There's a very effective and popular group working with addicts called Alcoholics Anonymous. And it has its roots back into the late 19th century. But its roots actually came from a religious organization called the Oxford Group. And this was a group of individuals from Oxford University that wanted to make the gospel applicable. How can we make the gospel work for our social problems and social dilemmas? And so they had this idea and this term they used called fellowship among those that were current or also struggling addicts. And the support they got from each other, knowing they were not alone, was a huge benefit to them, because prior to that, most addicts either sought medical help help of clergy, or went in isolation, trying to do better, trying to try harder, trying to fix this, trying to make it a matter of willpower. And we call that type of sobriety white knuckle sobriety. When we're open, when we confess our sins before others, which should sound kind of familiar to us and to our group, that accountability helps build support and resistance to addiction. But when we look at the cycle here, when we encounter stress, then we take a look at what other things can we do, rather than obsessing on what I want to do. Because oftentimes there'll be that tug of war, that little devil and little angel talking in each ear, and the one says, this is what we need to do. Oh, no, we got really sick the last time. Or we missed work and got in trouble with the boss last time. Oh, but all we need to do is just do less, not as much. We'll manage it better. That's not the problem. The problem is just management. So when that stress takes place and obsession is the factor, we look at other things to do. Contacting a sponsor or a fellow member of the group, talking to others, talking to a counselor, someone that you trust. So, and for a youth, that could certainly be a youth minister or a youth minister's wife. It could be a deacon. It could be a trusted friend that's a couple of grades older that would be helpful, that is respected, that could help during that phase of obsession. Or when it comes down to use and back up, hitting the shame and guilt, we have a remedy for shame and guilt here, don't we? It's called confession, repentance, forgiveness. These are things that God has supplied us with, that we don't have to be stuck in our shame and our guilt. This is another great place to exit the cycle and get help. And part of redemption and forgiveness is being public about it. It doesn't necessarily mean to the whole church, but someone you trust, someone that's accountable, that can help hold you accountable. So having others involved is very important in the overall recovery process. Certainly not something that can be done alone. Good. I would have to say of all the things that I work with in counseling, the topic of addiction is probably the toughest. And the sad part to it is oftentimes the saddest, because for us to make change, any kind of change requires motivation. And oftentimes the big push that finally motivates the addict to seek recovery is the loss of relationships, the breakup of the marriage, the alienation of the children, the things that a person loves the most. When they lose those things, that's when they're motivated to finally seek help. They refer to that as rock bottom. I finally hit rock bottom, now it's time to change. The problem with that is, the sad part to me is that when that change takes place, when they do get a hold of sobriety and start making the program work for them, and they come back healthier and getting towards whole, there might be forgiveness and redemption from God, but oftentimes not from the family. We call that compassion fatigue. The people have pushed and have encouraged and have rallied and put so much of who they are into the recovery efforts of the addict that they got burned out. And now everything they see, they don't trust, and they think this is just an attempt to win back love. As soon as I feel secure, he's going to disappoint me again, or she's going to disappoint me again. And that's a shame. I like to see people do better, people to get back where they were. I hate it when those losses don't come back. And oftentimes we see, because of their actions, some of the repercussions trickle down to the kids as well. And I've seen families, a set of twins, as adults who grew up in an alcoholic household. One of them never touched a drop in his whole life. The other followed in his father's footsteps and was an alcoholic as well. So sometimes parents can be good examples, and sometimes they can be good examples of bad examples. What to do and what not to do. And I guess all of us parents are a mix of both. The back row nods their head.
So what if you're a parent or a spouse of an addict and they've gone through that recovery? How do you overcome that lack of trust?
That's a very good question, because just like the addict is in recovery, the family members are in recovery as well, and they have to learn to trust. And they have to detach a certain degree from the addict and let them do the work. The message is, I can't want sobriety for you more than you want it for yourself. And so I have to let you take your course. I have to take my course in how I become whole again, because I put so much of myself out there and I've bent in so many ways that I need to recognize what real boundaries are and what healthy boundaries we need to put back in our place so that we can have something very normal. And really that rigidity, that sense of emotional detachment can be very good for the addict as they're continuing on, to know that I can't just lean on my spouse or the other family members to get to make the progress I need to make. I need to truly make this my actions and my determination to get there. But it's a difficult road for a spouse or family members. And there's support groups for those as well. Al-Anon is a very popular support group for spouses and family members of addiction that helps them establish stronger boundaries so that they're not enabling, which is a way of saying making addictive behavior easier for the addict. And so just like the addict is in recovery, they're in recovery from wanting to fix the addiction of the addict. And so they have a support group for that as well. Good question.
That was my next question, Russell, is how can an enabler affect an addict?
Definitely, and maybe point out exactly what does enabling mean. Taken, for instance, a very common family situation that may take place for an alcoholic. He drinks too much, he can't get up the next day to go to work, but it's important for the family for him to be at work and for him to keep his job and to have that income come in, or maybe have an insurance covered for the children. So he may be dead asleep, can't get up, can't go to work, so the wife just very casually picks up the phone like she's done many times before and calls in and says, he's got a case of the stomach bug. He looks like he's got the 24-hour flu. He should be in tomorrow, but he won't be in today, and hang up. Well, what she has done, she thinks, okay, I'm protecting my family. I'm taking care of the best interest of my family. But in response, she's also made it easier for him to continue in that behavior because she's taken a consequence away from him. Parents are very good about making excuses for the bad behavior of their children. And they'll defend a child in not allowing him or her to suffer consequences. That's enabling. It's when we allow them to continue on. Sometimes it can be the oldest child. Say we got a 14-year-old that's in the home with littler, younger siblings, and mom's too strung out on drugs to get anybody ready for school. So the 14-year-old gets up, gets her little brothers and sisters ready for school, and makes sure they all have a lunch pail. And they're heading off to class. She doesn't have any of her homework done because she's been busy being the little parent and keeping everybody else going. But even in her role of just plain survival, she's become an enabler to the addiction. And so it's very healthy to educate the family exactly what healthy boundaries look like. They get so caught up in these crazy roles, they don't know this is what a healthy marriage looks like, this is what a healthy wife's role is supposed to look like, this is how a mother's supposed to operate. And I'm sure even at your work, you all have to do a lot of training with, this is what parenthood looks like, this is how you handle a child that's throwing a tantrum, and just kind of baby step them through it to see. Because oftentimes they'll just go back to whatever mom and dad did for their way of dealing with these stressful events. And if mom and dad had the same crazy behavior, then who learns? Yeah. Good. I've been amazed at how high functioning some addicts can be and alcoholics. Some people that very much knock you off your feet when they talk about their problem and the depths of the problems that it has created. They can keep a very proper social front where you would know from the outside, but nobody behind the closed doors is unaware of what's going on, and they've all been affected by it as well. Thank you all so much. Alan, any closing remarks?
Yeah, let's show our appreciation to Russell.